So thank you for coming today. The topic I'm talking about is new markets. And I often get the question about, well, what is a new market? A lot of people have an intuitive sense of it. It might be a new territory, an emerging market. It could be a new product. It's actually all of that. It is new products like the iPad. It's new places like emerging markets. It's also new people. People who might have been historically shut out of a market because of products being too complicated or centralized or costly, and subject now to disruptive innovations that open up consumption to totally new classes of consumers. New markets are how the economy grows. If you look around you, just about everything you see used to be a new market one day. In fact, 42 of the 50 largest companies in the United States got their start with new markets, whether it's ExxonMobil with kerosene, then gasoline, then petrochemicals, to, of course, the local companies here, Apple and Google, and many, many others as well. So new markets are a critically important topic, not just for economic growth, but for corporate growth. There are patterns to how new markets develop. There are secrets to who wins and loses in new markets. And those patterns are totally distinct from how people win in established markets. Sadly, in business schools, in business literature, often what we read about is established markets, where things are a lot more certain. You know who your customers are, you understand the nature of demand, you know who your competitors are. In new markets, none of that stuff applies, and so you need a new lens to discern what's going to work and what won't in new markets. So what I want to do with you is start off talking about photography. It's a market that we all understand, and particularly with Lytro getting so much buzz from the Silicon Valley area in the past week, and revolutionizing photography, I thought let's go back to the invention of photography and understand how that market came to pass. Now, photography was first invented in France in 1826. And as you might expect, it was a very complicated endeavor. Cameras looked somewhat like that. They were big, they were heavy. You had a big drape over the back. And that doesn't even show half the paraphernalia that would go with the camera. You would have very heavy glass plates that would go inside the camera. And those glass plates had to be developed immediately, otherwise images would go bad. In order to develop the plates, you would have to have basically a small chemistry kit with you. So there was a lot of specialized knowledge that people had to have regarding how to take a picture, how to develop a picture. It was expensive, and it was very hard to do any of this outside of a photography studio, particularly when you're carrying glass plates and your mode of transportation is horseback. So people over time tried to improve on that very bulky and cumbersome process. So they came up with this, which is a wagon. I don't know if you can see here, there is a person here next to the wagon. And it gives you a sense of what a portable camera was back in those days. It wasn't terribly portable. And people tried improving upon the picture quality, the size of the images, and so you got stuff like this, which was bragged about at the time as being the world's largest camera. I don't know anybody who goes now to a Best Buy saying, I want to have the world's largest camera. But there were innovators back in the day who thought that that might be something that would be valuable. The common thread amongst all these solutions were that they were very complicated. They appealed to a specialist audience who understood the art of photography, and basically who had to be professional photographers. They were also highly centralized. You could not take these solutions easily into the field, and because you couldn't do that, there was just a lot that could not be captured. And they were quite costly, all of which added up to constrain consumption considerably. So to break that paradigm, a man in Rochester, New York named George Eastman started experimenting in his mother's kitchen with a type of film that didn't need the chemistry set, that wouldn't break. It would be based on celluloid, and it could fit in any camera and be simple enough for anybody to take a picture. He realized, far before Clayton Christensen codified the theory of disruptive innovation, he intuitively knew that if you broke that paradigm of complicated, centralized, and costly, and instead created simple, accessible, inexpensive, decentralized solutions, you could vastly increase consumption. Eastman invented what he called the Kodak camera to go along with celluloid film. And it was a technological marvel. It also flopped. People were not interested. And the reason they weren't is that professional photographers saw the quality of celluloid images as being inferior to what they did on glass plates. Moreover, they were proud of the art that they had learned in developing glass plates, and they had no interest in debasing that art by going over to celluloid photography. So Eastman knew that to make photography as convenient as a pencil, in his words, he would have to not only create a new technology, but also a new business model to make his innovation more readily applicable to the masses. So, as ingenious as his camera was the business model of selling a camera preloaded with film. Once you had exposed the 100 pictures in the camera, you sent the entire camera back to Rochester, New York, where all the images were developed, and then you received the camera back, again reloaded with film, and of course with the images. The concept was codified in an advertising slogan which has been voted one of the best of all time. You press the button, we do the rest. It's a great idea. And it didn't go anywhere. The problem was that he didn't have a channel to sell it. Historically, photography had been sold through corner shops because that's how we were going to distribute things like glass plates. They hated the Kodak camera. So they had no incentive to push anything like this, and in fact, talked it down. So Eastman needed to have a direct channel to sell in his innovation to people who might be motivated. Fortunately, at the same time that the technology was developing and the mail service was improving to the extent that he could do this sort of direct model, you had the advent of mass publications like the Saturday Evening Post. So he could place articles like this one. So the genius of George Eastman was not just technology, it was also business model and channel. And that is a pattern you see over and over and over again in new markets. Oftentimes there's a long period during which technologies are in gestation. Finally, they get to be good enough to appeal to a segment of the population who might not be as demanding as people who were consuming some of the early experiments, but find that the technology is simple or accessible enough for them to experiment with it and hopefully to become reference customers for other consumers later on. But then you also have a business model and a new motivated channel that unlocks all that consumption. Only then do new markets bloom. Now, I often get 3 questions about how to tackle a new market. And these questions come from startups, they come from Fortune 50 companies. They're pretty consistent. The first are, what are signs of a market ready to take off? We sort of intuitively have a good idea about what's an interesting idea, but how do we know that the market is really ready to embrace it? Secondly, who should we target first? And then last, how early is too early? How late is too late? I've been very early, too early with some things in my career, like mobile marketing, mobile commerce. Then I've done some other things very well, like mobile networks in Africa. That was partly by luck. There wasn't a thought-through pattern, but actually there is a discernible way to say when something is hitting the market at the right time. So there are 8 different categories under which you could think about signs of market readiness, and those group into 3 different areas of few dependencies, relative advantage, and low perceived risk. I'm not going to go over each of these in detail. You can see them up there. But what I want to ask you is, when you think about the ventures that you're enthusiastic about, do they fit those criteria or not? There are a lot of people I work with, particularly entrepreneurs are susceptible to this, who are incredibly zealous about what they're doing. And they have to be to motivate their employees, to appeal to investors. But if you look at business history, it isn't the innate quality of an idea that necessarily determines whether something is going to take off fast. Indoor plumbing is a really good idea. And I ask an entrepreneur, is your idea really better than indoor plumbing? When they say that it is, then you know to not sign that check right there. A little delusional. Indoor plumbing took 4,500 years from its invention to its broad application in the 19th century. Now, if you compare it to this pattern, it had strikeouts against most of these criteria. The idea itself was pretty darn simple, but unfortunately you needed a water supply, you also needed sewage, you needed people like builders and architects and city planners and the owners of houses all to agree that an idea like this was good. And the risk of an indoor plumbing system failing was pretty dire. You really didn't want to be there if your plumbing system sprang a leak inside the house. Now, sushi. This is California. I'm sure people like sushi here, right? Actually, the first American sushi restaurant was started in Los Angeles in 1966. But it took 20 years for sushi to become broadly available throughout the United States. It had strikeouts against many of these criteria. But then you think about one of the greatest consumer electronic successes of all time. I'm not talking about the iPad. I'm talking about radio. So the first US commercial radio broadcast was in 1920. By 1930, 60% of US households owned radio. It was massively successful, and it scored well against almost all of these criteria. So freeing yourself from those constraints, even if the idea seems trivial, like radio, versus a fundamental idea, like indoor plumbing, if you're free of those constraints, you can have very rapid growth. Second question, which customers do you target first? So here's one of your local neighbors. Facebook is a wonderful example of a company that was not first to market. It was well after Friendster and Classmates and MySpace, but it had a laser focus on a foothold market. And because of that laser focus, it was able to gain scale within a well-defined foothold market more rapidly than its competitors, develop reference customers, and then gain broader sets of clients after that. So a foothold market, like the university students that Facebook initially targeted, allows a company, whether it's a startup or a Fortune 50 enterprise, to have speed to market because it has a very clear focus about what it needs to do. You get scale within a narrow foothold, so you understand, at least for that foothold, you become the dominant supplier, even if it's a very small market. You get reference customers. People begin talking about you, know about you, because you have scale within that foothold. There's a signal to competitive firms that there are many other elements of the new market where they might play, but in this particular niche, you're the leader, so back off. And there's flexibility because you're not trying to be all things to all people. You're not trying to do everything at once. You're trying to target one foothold at a time and grow from there. There are signs of good footholds here. I'm not going to go through them all. The key one I want to point your attention to is the fact that they need to be easily satisfied. A lot of folks, when they pioneer a new market, they want to go for the prestigious customers, the marquee accounts. That is very, very dangerous. They are highly demanding, and they can take a very long time to sell into. I ran a startup once in the mobile middleware space. We had a couple of options about where we would go for our first customers. I had a telecom operator in Malta that was eager for our solution. I won't give them the time of day. Vodafone was interested. We spent 2 years selling to Vodafone, ultimately successfully. But 2 years of bet the company decisions, changing the specification on the software 50 times, and ultimately success, but it was far from a sure thing. So rather than going to Vodafone and making ultimately what was a one-size-fits-one product, it would have been a lot better to go to Malta, create a basic solution for an undemanding customer who had very few other people knocking on the door, and then march up market from there. So the third question, when is too early and when is too late? A lot of people talk about first mover advantage, or they talk about fast follower. And they sort of, it's like they have a religion. Either they believe in being a first mover or a fast follower. Business doesn't work that way. It really depends upon the circumstances of a market, whether being early is best or whether being a fast follower is right. So if you want to be early, then you need to develop entry barriers. Otherwise, really, what's the point of being early? Maybe there are modest entry barriers, but it's better for a follower, particularly a big cash-rich follower, to buy some of the pioneers rather than do something on their own. There's a couple of downsides about being early too. You can get locked in to inappropriate business models or inappropriate technologies or inappropriate channel partners or ecosystem partners. And you might have very high upfront costs to develop a technology or educate customers, leaving the door open for subsequent firms to come on in, take advantage of the expenditures that you've made, and then capitalize on that by having a much more appropriate model for what the ultimate demand turns out to be. That being said, some early movers do win. Zipcar, very tough to supplant them. They have an 80% share of the US car rental market for by-the-hour rentals. They've locked up some key technology. They've locked up the best sites, the best customers. They have identified their brand with the industry. So even though Hertz is trying to knock them off, it'll be very, very difficult to do so. The Wiggles, far and away the world's biggest rock band catering to children. They don't just have records, they have a TV show, they have a concert tour, they have merchandise, they have a whole cast of characters. It's a parallel universe. Other people are just musicians. Given that kids typically aren't looking for fresh hits, it's going to be very tough to supplant the Wiggles. And in fact, those folks are making $45 million a year. They are Australia's highest paid entertainers because they have that first mover advantage of nailing that market of children's rock before anybody else. Now, fast followers can do quite well in certain circumstances. You can focus on a niche. Orkut does that in the social networking space. Nobody's going to challenge Facebook now to be the general social network, but Orkut does very well in Brazil, where it has the dominant market share. You can ride a different horse, which Microsoft did with Excel. Far from the first spreadsheet program, but the first to be on Windows, and because it was on Windows, it gained broad acceptance quickly. Or you can leverage a network. Visa was not the first credit card. Diners Club was. But Visa was the first credit card that was broadly available to banks around the country. And so the network of banks pushing the idea of credit cards made that grow quickly. Late followers can win as well. You think about Samsung or Apple in the mobile telephony industry. There are certain traits there that made them win, particularly the presence of strong channels that wanted competition. Carriers like Verizon or Vodafone wanted there to be competition. And when they want that, sure enough, it happens. So I'm going to leave you with some thoughts about how new markets are different. In established markets, you think about competition, but really in new markets, your competition is nothing. It's non-consumption. And competitors can actually be good in unlocking initial consumption. In established markets, people want to move fast. There are times in new markets you may want to move fast, but equally, there are times when you might want to hold back and see how things develop. Established markets benefit from powerful sales channels. In new markets, going direct to the end user may be the best way to get your start. You learn more about a customer, you establish that foothold, and then you have the flexibility to adapt in a way that sales channels just might not want you to do. Targeting big markets makes sense for established markets, but in new markets, those big markets don't exist. And the biggest customer segments may take the longest to come around to adopt your initial products or services. So targeting footholds is what you want to do, and then you can get big. And finally, in established markets, it's all about leveraging fixed costs. You do your pro formas. If it means that you have to spend a lot of money in year one to be financially efficient, that's what you'll do. In new markets, that's foolish. What you want to do is have flexibility. Even if it costs you more in the short term, it's going to save you a lot in the long term. There's a lot of experimentation in new markets. There's a lot of learning. Ultimately, there's a lot of failure. But the successes are what power growth for companies, for economies, for careers. So that's why you got to get out there. You need to try. You need to stay flexible. You need to listen to the market. And you need to disregard all the reasons to delay. In this economy, this is the time to act. Thanks.